welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round, bookworms, because the time has come for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today, you will get to hear part 2 of chapter 13 of No Regrets by Ace Frehley from Kiss. Let's find out what happens next. After months of being catered to by so many different people and visiting so many different places, the road became a blur. Once in a while, though, certain nights would stand out, either because of the pure ecstasy of the event, or because I came dangerously close to losing it all. The next story is an example of the latter, and involves an enormous stroke of luck. No pun intended, or maybe just a little. We refer to it as the Golf Club Affair. It involved me, Peter, and Don Wesley. As I mentioned earlier, Don was the VP of Artist Development for Casablanca Records. Peter and I affectionately nicknamed Don the Director. The story begins back at the hotel after a show. We rendezvoused for some drinks and wines, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. The next thing you know, we were joined by 3 chicks. From the looks of these gals, it appeared we were in store for a very accommodating evening. Alcohol, coke, and quaaludes filled the next hour or two as we savored the fruits of those lovely ladies. Later, some of us got hungry and decided to have a snack. Since we were in the hospitality suite, there was a long table of food just there for the taking. After we ate, we started painting the girls' bodies with the onion dip and salad dressing, thinking it might liven things up a bit. The event quickly evolved into a contest for the best body painting design. Another hour passed, and after a few showers, some of us started losing interest. Don, for one, had turned his back on his female canvas and begun practicing his golf swing. Peter had put on a cape and was diving off the furniture into God knows what, pretending to be Superman. I was bent over the table doing a line of blow, when all of a sudden I heard a cracking sound, and out of the corner of my eye, I watched the girl near Dawn hit the floor with a thud. Dawn had been unaware of her approach from behind, and had clocked her on the side of the head with his golf club. She hit the carpet. I remember looking at Dawn, and I remember Peter saying, "Holy, what a shot!" Being completely wasted, we all started laughing, but within seconds, our laughter quickly turned into deep concern for her well-being, since she wasn't moving. I remember thinking to myself, what a up way to end such a great party. I could just imagine the headline: "Groupie taken out in hotel suite by golf club." Don had a look of grave concern on his face, since he was looking at a lengthy prison sentence if she was in fact gone. Time stood still for a moment as we tried to revive the fallen angel. Suddenly, a slight moan rose from her mouth as she rolled over onto her back. With half-opened eyes, she slowly raised her head, and with a deep breath, sat up on the carpet. Seconds later, with a bewildered look on her face, she spoke. "What the was that?" I said to her, "Sorry, baby. Are you okay?" Don was practicing his golf swing, and I guess you eluded his peripheral vision. Within no time, she was back on her feet, bent over the table, snorting another line of coke, oblivious to how close she had come to not making it. We just looked at each other in amazement, thinking, what a close call. Our guardian angels must have been watching over us that night. The sun was coming up, and the party continued until we all fell asleep. So many close calls, so many disasters averted. I have no idea how or why I'm still around. I took so many chances and pushed the envelope of fate so far, sometimes it almost seems like these things never really happened. But they did, and I'm just thankful I lived to talk about it and learn from my mistakes. There was the time in a large southern city, for instance, when we trashed a hotel room in grand style. Peter was there getting down with one of rock's best-known groupies, a chick named Sweet Sweet Connie from Arkansas, who was immortalized in the Grand Funk Railroad song "We're an American Band." I was feeling very lovable that evening, and jumped into bed between Peter and Connie, but after a few minutes it was apparent I was an unwelcome guest, so I retreated to the safety of my room, where another party was beginning. My friend Donnie from Westchester showed up. Why in the name of was Donnie down there? I have no idea. And the fourth person was a famous stock car driver who shall remain nameless. Let's just say he was a big deal at the time. And this was the Deep South, remember, where stock car drivers were treated like, well, rock stars. So the party progressed as it usually did, with a lot of alcohol and coke and whatever, until I came up with the brilliant idea to begin tossing the furniture out the window. Now, I did not invent this concept, but I did almost perfect it. My buddies looked a little unwilling at first to participate, especially since we were 20 stories up, and my windows faced out onto a busy street. But once I began the festivities by grabbing a lamp and hurling it out the window, they quickly decided to go along with the plan. Next went a wooden chair and an end table. Then a desk flew out the window, followed by a television set. Each item exploded spectacularly. Crack! When it hit the street below, splintering in all directions and terrifying passer-by. Next, we somehow maneuvered a love seat through the open window. Again, we could have hurt someone, but I don't recall thinking it was anything but hilarious at the time. The severity of our actions didn't occur to me until our road manager, Frankie Shinlerow, came running into the room, panicked and breathless. "Are you guys out of your minds?" he asked. "The cops are on their way." "Uh-oh," I said between giggles. "No, man, this is serious." He pointed at Donnie and the stock car driver. "You guys, get the out of here." I started to leave with them. "It's your room, Ace," Frankie pointed out. "They're gonna find you." "What do you want me to do?" "Get in bed, get under the covers, keep your mouth shut. Let me do the talking." The state troopers arrived just minutes later, and I eagerly listened to the conversation from under the sheets while pretending to be asleep. They were ready to take me away without discussion, and who could blame them? There was furniture flying out of my room like missiles. But Frankie handled the whole thing like a pro. Frankie was a crazy and had seen it all and could bull with the best of them. Frankie had also road managed Alice Cooper before coming on board with Kiss, so he knew a little something about rock star excess. Kiss, though, was almost too much even for Frankie. "I'm sorry, officer," I heard him say. "Ace had a party with a lot of people in his room, but unfortunately he drank a little too much and passed out in his bed hours ago. He's not the guilty party here, and people have been in and out of this room all night. I don't even know most of them. Ace was just trying to give back some southern hospitality. He had nothing to do with these holes who tossed the furniture. Believe me, he'll be pissed when he wakes up in the morning." Incredibly enough, they bought it. Or they didn't buy it, but just didn't care enough to make an example of me. Especially since there were no witnesses and no one was actually injured in the whole insane episode. Kiss had that kind of clout. Either way, without Frankie's intervention, I'm sure I would have ended up in jail that night. Instead, I lay there for a while, relieved and thankful for Frankie's skills of persuasion, wondering what adventures awaited me in the next city, and whether I would be so lucky. During the 1970s and 80s, most people who were doing a lot of coke usually came up with some sort of code name or alias for the word coke, especially when talking about it on the telephone. You never knew if the phone was bugged. In my social circle, names came and went, but the one that remained my favorite over the years was Betty White. If I was talking to a friend on the phone and wanted to know if there was going to be Coke at a particular party, I'd just say, "Hey, is Betty going to be at the party?" We always laughed about it when we met face to face, and how could you not? I mean, it's just too funny for words, and so is the real Betty White. I love her a lot, and I think she's the most underrated female comedian on the planet. Alcohol and Betty were my constant companions, my best friend and worst enemy. Sometimes they were a detriment to my career and personal life. Overall, I guess, you'd have to argue they were mainly a bad thing, inasmuch as they nearly finished me. Sometimes, though, being loaded worked to my advantage, as it did on October 31st, 1979, when Kiss made a memorable Halloween night appearance on NBC's Tomorrow Show. Hosted by the friendly and sometimes confrontational Tom Snyder, Tomorrow was a popular and successful late-night talk show that attracted some of the biggest names in politics and show business. Hey, John Lennon did Tomorrow. How could Kiss turn it down? Well, we couldn't, and our appearance was one for the ages. I was nervous as hell about going on network TV, live, in front of millions of people. So I started pounding some Stoli in the back of my limo as soon as it passed through my gates on the way to the city. Now, I might have been a formidable drinker in those days, but I wasn't really a vodka drinker. The bottle was nestled in the door of the limo, and I reached for it to escape the anxiety I was feeling. By the time we arrived at the NBC studios in Rockefeller Center, I had a pretty good buzz on, and all my nervousness had subsided. When I got into the dressing room, Bill Aucoin showed up with a bottle of champagne, and I had a glass with him and Jeanette. Just before I left the dressing room, I snorted a few lines of blow to balance off all the alcohol and give me a little edge. By the time we took our places opposite Tom on the set, in full Kiss costume and makeup, I was feeling no pain, and I was ready for anything. My amusement began with an introductory voiceover, during which Snyder described our act, and in the process, referred to Gene as the bass player. As in small mouth, large mouth, striped, or Chilean sea. By the time he got around to me, I could barely contain my amusement. So when Tom said, "This is Ace Frehley, lead guitarist," I responded with, "I'm not the lead guitarist, I'm the trout player." And then I cracked up, and so did Tom, much to the chagrin of Paul, and especially Gene. Hey, Gene would be the first to admit that he is a control freak. So is Paul. They always wanted to control Kiss, and they wanted to control me. But I had talent and a mind of my own, and had different ideas about the direction of Kiss. Gene and Paul were caught in this dichotomy. Oh, Ace. We love him. We hate him. We don't want to put up with his bull anymore, and he doesn't want to put up with ours. But we can't get rid of him because the fans love him. "You're supposed to be some sort of spaceman, right?" Tom asked me at one point while gesturing to my costume. "No, actually I'm a plumber." Snyder laughed from his gut and fired right back. "Oh, well, I've got a piece of pipe backstage I'd like to have you work on." A hanging curveball if I ever saw one. Regardless, I completed the joke with the delivery of a Major League All-Star. "Tell me about it." There was no live audience in the studio, but just about everyone there, including the crew, doubled over with laughter. If you watch the video, you can actually see me turning to Gene and putting my hands up at one point and quietly saying, "What?" like a boy who's misbehaving at a family function and wants his dad to loosen up and join in the fun. Gene was sometimes incapable of that, even in a setting that clearly called for some spontaneity and horsing around. It was all so ridiculous. How seriously can you take yourself when you're sitting there in a superhero costume and full-face makeup? Gene missed the whole thing. If he would have allowed himself to be just a little more lighthearted about everything and stopped thinking about money all the time. Things might have turned out differently. I love the guy, but he never, ever got it. You could have cut the air in that studio with a knife. Tom picked up on Gene's negativity, and you could tell he wasn't digging it. At one point, Gene tried to make a joke about selling Tom some swampland in New Jersey, and Snyder completely ignored him and turned his attention back to me. It was like Gene didn't exist. Tom Snyder may have been a newsman, but he realized very quickly that it was more entertaining to let me laugh and tell jokes than it was to allow Gene to bore everyone with his uptight humor. Afterward, I got tons of phone calls congratulating me on my performance. "You were a riot, Ace. You stole the show." Yeah, that was a classic performance, and it might have been the first time that a single appearance so clearly delineated the diverse personalities of Kiss. The show speaks for itself, and that's all I'm going to say about it. Everyone should judge for themselves what really happened. I enjoyed myself on the show, and really wasn't trying to piss off anyone. I was just being the Space Ace. After the interview, Tom came back to my dressing room, and we shook hands and had another good laugh. I thought he was very genuine, and he seemed to really enjoy the experience. Being a rock star provided access to people and relationships I never would have known otherwise. My friendship with John Belushi certainly falls into this category. I met John one night at Peter's pad in the city. Peter lived on the east side with his wife Lydia, and I was always a welcome guest in their home. I walked in and John was just kicking back on Peter's couch, having a cold beer and making small talk. We all exchanged greetings, and I cracked open a cold one as well. A few beers later, the obvious question arose. Did I have any coke? In those days, I almost always had at least a few grams of blow on me, but on that particular night, I had just scored some really good. Once I announced the good news, everyone in the room rose to attention and proceeded to partake of the sparkling powder. More wines and cold beer filled the next hour or two, with jokes flying back and forth across the room until we were all laughing hysterically. Lydia was always a lot of fun to be around. We had the same sense of humor and shared a lot of inside jokes about the band. She was with Peter from the beginning, and over the years had become a trusted friend and confidant. I could usually make her laugh at the drop of a hat, but what was more interesting to me was that John seemed to be laughing at almost all my jokes. I had been told for years that I was a funny guy, but to be making a professional comedian crack up felt even more rewarding. There's a strange bonding process that happens sometimes between two people when alcohol and coke are involved. That bond was cemented that evening between me and John, and remained that way until the end. We were both famous, and we both loved music and comedy, and we also enjoyed getting up. John and Kiss rose to prominence on parallel lines. He was one of the breakout stars on Saturday Night Live in its first few seasons, beginning in the fall of 1975, while Kiss was selling out arenas and stadiums around the world in the late 1970s. John was in the process of becoming a movie star as well, first with Animal House and then with the Blues Brothers. John used to take me down to his private bar south of Canal Street, which he owned with fellow Blues Brothers Dan Aykroyd. What a trip that was. Those guys liked to party, obviously, and yet they really couldn't go out in New York without getting harassed by fans for autographs or photo opportunities, which was another thing we had in common. John and Dan bought their own bar and sealed the windows with cinder blocks. A steel door with a peephole served as the front entrance. To the average passerby, the building looked almost abandoned. That was the beauty of the club. It was never technically open. They used it primarily on Saturday nights for a hangout and to entertain guests after the show. Anyone driving or walking by on a Saturday night or Sunday morning might have thought it was a mob hangout because the street would be filled with stretch limousines, but in reality, the bar was filled with the cast and guests of SNL. I was there on some of those nights, and the parties were great, but a little too crowded for my tastes. During the week, though, the place was empty, and for me, that was a dream come true. I mean, just imagine how cool it would be to have your own private bar in Manhattan to hang out in and do whatever you wanted. I'd get behind the bar and act like a bartender for John and any other guests we had invited. Then we'd switch places, tell some stupid jokes, and knock over the drinks. We'd clean off the bar, lay down 2-foot lines of coke, and try to snort them in one breath. Then we'd dance on top of the bar, or ask some girls I had invited to do a striptease, while John and I played the guitar and drums on the little bandstand. It was total decadence, and we enjoyed every second of it. I can remember staggering outside with John one time in the early morning hours, climbing into my Porsche and driving to a nearby deli for a beer run. Yes, we had drunk all the beer in the bar, and passing out in the car in front of the deli, only to be rudely awakened by businessmen and secretaries on their way to work. They'd be looking into the windows of my black 928, curiously trying to figure out who the disheveled occupants were. John and I just laughed at them, saying in effect, "You suckers. You and your jobs. We don't have to work this morning." And so it went on, sometimes for days on end. I remember calling up Jeanette one morning after 1 or 2 nights out with John and hearing screams on the other end of the phone. Jeanette was understandably pissed, but I also knew she was a huge fan of both John and SNL. I thought to myself, if I put John on the phone with Jeanette, maybe he could calm her down and buy me some time. John got on the phone and launched into his famous Marlon Brando impersonation from a streetcar named Desire. John started yelling, "Stella, Stella, Stella!" After his routine was finished, he also tolerated me to coach him on an upcoming skit on the show. Within a few minutes, Jeanette's anger had melted away. She told John it was okay for me to stay out for another day. We went back to the bar, or my apartment, or someone else's apartment, and continued the party till we passed out again. The most memorable story I can share about John is one that reflects the guy's inherent sensitivity and insecurity. You see, like a lot of performers, John wasn't quite the egomaniac he appeared to be on stage, or at least, I don't think he was. I was at the Palladium, formerly the Academy of Music, one night in the summer of 1980, shortly after the Blues Brothers movie had come out. Belushi and Aykroyd had embarked on a legitimate concert tour with a great backup band, and anybody who was anybody in New York was at the Palladium on 14th Street that night to see the Blues Brothers in action. They played for about 45 minutes, then took a break with the understanding that they'd come back out and do a second set. I was hanging out backstage with a date and all the other celebrities when I got the word that no one was allowed in the dressing room to visit the Blues Brothers. Suddenly the promoter, Ron Delsener, came running up to me. "Ace, we have a big problem." "What's up?" I said. "Ron told me John didn't want to go back out to do the second half of the show, supposedly because his voice was shot." "What can I do?" I asked him. Ron said, "Can you try talking to him? I told him you were here." Delsener paused, then gestured toward my date for the evening, a very tall and lovely New York model. "With your friend." "Okay," I said. "I'll give it a shot." As I proceeded to go upstairs to the dressing room, everyone who was milling around backstage looked up at me with amazement. I could hear some of them saying under their breath, "How come Ace can get in to see John and Dan and we can't?" Paul and Jean were also part of the crowd, looking confused. My model friend was wearing a very short skirt that night, and you could easily see her sheer underpants as we ascended the stairs, adding insult to injury to some of the onlookers. A minute later, I was in the dressing room, asking John how he was feeling. He shook his head. "I don't know, man. My voice is shot. I can't sing." I just smiled. His voice sounded terribly hoarse, and I suggested he drink some hot tea with honey. While he sipped the tea, I tried to cheer him up with a few stupid Ace jokes. Then I hiked up my friend's dress to lift his spirits. "Come on, John," I said. "You don't want to disappoint the Big Apple, do you?" He just looked at me, his face filled with sadness and fatigue. "I don't think I can do it, Ace." I chuckled. "Hey, nobody really gives a..." "Stop worrying. I can't sing either. I just fake it most of the time, but I get out there anyway. Hell, Mick Jagger can't sing. Dylan can't sing. They just kind of talk the words. Everybody does it in rock and roll, especially when they're on tour and they blow out their voice. Remember, the show must go on, and you're a professional." John smiled. "I guess." "Right. Just talk your way through it. Everyone out there loves you. It'll be great." We joked around a little more and had a beer and did a few lines of coke. Slowly, John's mood began to change for the better. After a few more lines and a little female entertainment, John decided he would finish the show. I told John to break a leg, and I'd see him after the show. I left the dressing room smiling and informed Delciner that the show would begin shortly. Ron was so thrilled he hugged me and said, "I can't thank you enough. I guess that's why they call you the Ace. You really saved the day. I owe you one, buddy." In the winter of 1982, I got a call from John, as I did on occasion, usually when he was in town and wanted someone to hang out with or needed some blow. I wasn't available at the time, and here's why. He caught me during one of my cleansing periods. This was something I did from time to time, probably out of instinct, and I honestly believe it's the only reason I'm alive today. I would take a break from the self-abuse, give myself a chance to come back from the precipice. Even on the road with Kiss, I sort of knew how much my body could take before I'd need a rest. Sometimes I'd look at the calendar, notice we were going to be in a particular city for 3 or 4 days, and I'd shut everything down. No alcohol, no coke, no painkillers. I'd put a sign on my door saying, "Quarantine by the Board of Health," and then I'd take a bunch of tranquilizers and sleep for 2 days. My bodyguards gave everyone strict orders not to call or knock on my door. That allowed me to recharge my batteries. I'd usually wake up refreshed, take a hot bath, have some breakfast, and start the whole crazy cycle all over again, feeling as though I'd bought myself a little more time. When John called me, he had just flown in from California, where he had been working on what would be his last film, Neighbors, and was going to be in town for only a couple of days. "Come on, Ace," he said. "Let's hook up in the city." "Sorry, John, can't do it. I'm cleaning up for a while. I just need a break from the insanity." I remember him laughing on the other end of the phone. I suppose it did sound funny, the idea of me not wanting to party. A break from the insanity? What do you mean? I was Mr. Insanity, from outer space. I must admit, his offer was tempting, and I hadn't seen him for weeks, but I had been burning the candle at both ends, and just wanted to stop feeling like for a little while. I also wanted to relax and hang out with my 2-year-old daughter Monique, and be daddy for a while. Also, don't forget, I'm a Taurus through and through. Once I've made up my mind, that's it. I very rarely reverse a decision. We had a few more laughs, and eventually he decided to give up and make other plans. He told me he'd call when he got back from LA on the next run, and then said goodbye. I didn't realize that would be the last time I'd ever speak to John. If I had known, I would have dropped everything and met him in the city, no questions asked. A few weeks later, I was watching the news when I heard that John had overdosed in Los Angeles. I was in complete shock. An overwhelming feeling of sadness came over me. I was never going to see him again. I had become very fond of John, and suddenly I realized all the fun we had together was over. He had told me a few months earlier that he wanted to put me in his next film, since I was one of the few people who could always crack him up. Now, it was just a dream. We had a mutual admiration. John Belushi was a great guy and a gifted performer. I feel very lucky to have known him. This was a tragedy, and was the catalyst for me to clean up my act for several months afterward. I still think about the crazy times we had together and get a smile on my face. I just wish things could have turned out differently. John was a comedic genius, and no one has ever been able to fill his shoes. He was unique. I miss him. I think everyone does. Well, that's the end of part 2. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.